Welcome to everybody this morning. It's so nice to see all of you, those of you joining us in person, those of you joining us on Zoom, on YouTube, and Facebook. Gemar Chatima Tova. So we start out with a bird's eye view above the Middle Eastern desert. We look around, and there's a seemingly endless, vast expanse of sand and outcrops. Perhaps we see animals running across the desert floor. They seemingly always know where they're supposed to be and when. We look right and left, we look forward, we look back, and every new direction comes the expectation of something different. A mirage, perhaps, able to trick even the most seasoned of desert travelers into thinking that they found it. They found an oasis. We zoom in closer and closer. We go towards the desert floor until we happen upon the memory of an older man in his own wanderings throughout the desert. He's walking on, and we can tell that this man has clearly been here before. He knows this landscape. He knows the desert all too well. And he understands that he shouldn't be given any false hope by the mirage. But at the same time, he's keenly aware that real hope, real meaning might not lie in any of the specific features that he comes across, but rather in the totality of the experience. We zoom out again, up and up from the desert floor, this time seemingly leaving the Middle East, leaving the desert altogether. And instead we enter into a multi-thousand-year conversation about our desert friend. The most important section of our Torah, the most important parsha, the portion in the Torah where we finally make it to Sinai. This is the climax. We're about to receive the Torah. We're about to receive the Ten Commandments. Isn't named for any of these things. It's not called Parsha, the portion of Sinai. It's not called the portion Aseret Dibrot, the portion of the Ten Commandments. It's not called Parshat HaTorah, the portion of the Torah, or any other title that we might think would make sense for such a magnificent portion of Torah. Rather, what's forever known as the central portion of Torah in our tradition is named after our desert traveler, an enigmatic man named Yitro, about whom very little is said in the text of the Torah. But who really was this man? Who was this desert traveler that would eventually become the father-in-law of Moses? A man that would eventually come to join the Israelites as they traveled and wandered throughout the desert. A man that will forever go down in Jewish history as the first convert to our tradition. A person so seemingly important as to have this entire parsha, the most important parsha in the Torah, named after him. Every single year as we go through our calendar, we always have a Parsha Yitro. A shepherd by trade, Yitro, otherwise known as Jethro, had been a nomad for the early years of his life, traveling all throughout the arid and unforgiving landscape of the ancient Middle East. Storms, famine, the ubiquity of droughts that we know all too well from the pages of our Hebrew Bible, Yitro had seen it all before eventually settling in Midian. Suddenly a flashback. We zoom in on Yitro as a young boy sitting in class with a dream to become a shepherd. In those days, at the dawn of the early Iron Age, to be a shepherd was an implicit rebellion against the normal way of life. Oh, are you still running around in those hilltops after all those sheep? Yitro can still remember the jeering and the bullying of his young classmates when he dared to express his longing for the hills. Why don't you just become a farmer like everyone else? I don't get it. The echoes of teachers' concerns ring in his mind. In those days, in the early Iron Age, to be a shepherd was to be a seeker. It was to care about others beyond oneself. It was to want more out of life than the mundanities of a society becoming increasingly obsessed with material growth. To be a shepherd was to value ancient wisdom and tradition in a quickly changing and evolving world. It was a philosophic disposition that highlighted the fact that the shepherd was open to the discovery of deep truths and fundamental secrets wherever they may lead them. The shepherd, they say, will go wherever they are taken on the journey. But as Yitro grew up, he would soon come to realize that truth, that happiness, and most importantly, meaning is elusive. It's not always easily found. You know, it's a funny thing when it comes to finding meaning. It's something that we all inherently crave. something that we all long for as we go about the journey of our lives. Finding meaning is often the first and the last standard as we evaluate our relationships to the people around us, the things we do, the activities we participate in, and the communities we identify with. Is it meaningful? Is this meaningful? Will this be meaningful? We find ourselves asking these questions over and over in the internal conversation going on in our mind. And we have such little patience when the answer is anything other than an immediate and resounding yes. How quick are we to discard anything, be it another person, be it living in a certain place, a job, a thing that doesn't bring us instant gratification? The rabbis paint more of the background to Yitro. And they tell us that by the time we meet Jethro, in the early pages of the book of Exodus, he had spent years out on his own search. Born into the polytheistic society of the ancient world, Yitro had spent years becoming an expert in the diverse religious traditions of the world around him. He worshipped idol after idol. He adopted religious creed after religious creed. But the aha moment never came. Yitro never felt at home. Other later rabbinic legends place Yitro as an early advisor to Pharaoh. He had slowly but surely climbed the upper echelons of political power after his graduate studies at the University of Moab, eventually making it into the inner boardrooms of the Egyptian political elite. He was in the room, the rabbis tell us, when Pharaoh was sitting there on that fateful day thinking about the decision about whether or not to throw all of the Israelite boys into the Nile. But the rabbis tell us that Yitro was so disgusted by this policy that he hung up his political hat, and he knew that Pharaoh's Egypt wasn't a home for him either. We often go around in life searching for meaning, as if it's an object that we've lost, as if meaning is simply an object that's hiding in some far-off and elusive place. We search and we search. Where can it be hiding? Where will I find meaning? Perhaps it's going to be in that next hobby I pursue. Perhaps that next job. Maybe my next relationship. That next hilltop over there in the horizon always seemingly looks to seemingly higher than our own vantage point. Surely I'll find meaning way over there. After storming out, after fleeing Egypt, Yitro was back wandering the seemingly infinite landscape of the rugged desert. But what happens when finding meaning, when the search for meaning is so seemingly elusive that we become even more desperate in our search? When we experience dead end after dead end, resulting in our patience for finding new experiences that might bring meaning growing even thinner? A couple years ago, at a Harvard Law graduation speech, one of the law graduates, a man named Pete Davis, captivated and shocked the audience when he spoke out against the idea of keeping our options open. Speaking to a room of Harvard Law graduates, people who quite literally, by any measure, had the ability to pursue a near infinite number of options in life, Davis began his extremely counterintuitive message. We're walking down a long hallway with endless doors branching off, Davis describes. And we go through life afraid to enter any of the doors because we're afraid that any time we enter a door, it will inherently close off a countless number of others. So instead, we spend our lives stuck in a hallway, what Davis coined the infinite browsing mode, where we're always on the search for something better. Yitro too browsed and he browsed. He wandered and wandered through this endless landscape of the desert. Another religious temple, another job, another hilltop, but nothing was able to quench his thirst. There must be more to all of this, Yitro thought. All of us here are familiar with the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the story of how God took us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. But do we know that at the same time this was happening, on a parallel screen, Yitro was in the middle of his own memorable journey, on his own Exodus. He walked and he walked parallel to where the Israelite encampment was until eventually finding his way and climbing up a harsh crag surrounded by rocky outcrops. And he looked down and he saw something that seemed to have a slightly different aura than what he had been used to. Gazing from on the mountaintops, he looked down and he saw the Israelites at the foot of Sinai, about to commit to a way of life and a covenant that would still be talked about millennia later. But what was different about these people? He just couldn't put his finger on it. And moreover, at this point, we can understand that Yitro was extremely skeptical. He had seen too many mirages in his wandering throughout the desert. Their rituals, well, they seemed just as random as their ancient contemporaries. And sure, some of the ideas that they were talking about seemed revolutionary and ethically novel, but it was still too dressed in the ancient dogmas that Yitro had grown to have less and less patience for. The antidote to this infinite browsing mode, Davis concluded at his Harvard commencement speech, is our ability to commit to something. We're all stuck in a culture that provides infinite options, constantly tricking us into thinking that there's always something better, always something deeper, something that will make us happier, always something more meaningful further down the road. So we spend our life and we continuously swipe through options. We walk down the hallway of life, constantly looking into all the rooms on the right and the left of us. And moreover, we feel bad for those poor and sorry people that are stuck in one of the rooms. Don't they know, aren't they aware that outside of the room that they're in lies a myriad of unexplored options that potentially awaits them? What are they still doing in one of the rooms? Yet it is us who are endlessly stuck in the hallway of life, either afraid of or feeling perhaps that we're too wise, too knowledgeable to actually enter. So we continue further and further down the hallway. As Yitro began to spend more and more time amongst the ancient Israelites, he started to notice something that began to move him. No, it wasn't any of these specific beliefs. There wasn't one particular ritual that he caught on to. He stayed for services. There wasn't one prayer during the service that inspired an aha moment. And it certainly, Yitro thought to himself, wasn't any of the sermons that went on and on about some seemingly random people from the past. But Yitro couldn't help but notice that when it came to this new tradition at the foot of Sinai, the whole began to emerge to be greater than the sum of its parts. He began to see an age-old secret that had been fostering in the Jewish community for thousands of years. The idea so foundational to our tradition, that meaning, that happiness, isn't to be found in an end, but rather in a means. That value and meaning isn't something that we happen upon, but rather something that we create, that we have the ability to create through our process of commitment. As scary as it is to commit in life, having no commitments is much scarier. Yom Kippur is an invitation to take notice and stock as to how we live our lives, to part with a pervasive myth that meaning is something we'll one day arrive at or discover, that it's only on another hilltop out there that we just need to keep walking towards. No. We create and we unearth meaning through our commitments and through our obligation to something beyond ourselves. There's a famous story about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel on Yom Kippur morning, where he looked into the pews and he noticed that one of his students was sitting in the back during davening, during services, staring blankly down at his machzor. Every couple of minutes, the student would look down, start to mutter something, and shake his head and continue to stare blankly. And this went on for hours and hours. And finally, at the end of the service, Rabbi Heschel walked to him, and in the most loving way, he said, "My student, is everything okay? What seems to be the matter this morning?" "Oh, it's nothing," the student replied. "I just didn't have it in me to pray today. The Spirit just didn't happen to move me." "My son," Heschel concluded, "sometimes in life, the Spirit moves you, but much more often, it is us, it is you, that must move the Spirit." I like to think of Yitro newly arriving into the Israelite camp, setting up his tent with a large protective aura of skepticism around him. He hears the 10 Commandments, he hears the myriad of ritualistic mitzvot, he hears the laws of interpersonal relations, but he still isn't convinced. Perhaps Yitro was about to leave the camp. His bags already packed, they were over his shoulder. He was about to continue on his journey throughout the desert, another stop, another temporary stop throughout the infinite landscape. But suddenly he heard something. It started off as a small voice, but eventually got louder and louder. A phrase that we've become so foundational to our tradition. a phrase that highlights not a conclusion, but a process. Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. One of the most foundational imperatives of our Jewish tradition, Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. Not you are already holy, not we are all already holy, but that we can become holy. That holiness in Judaism is not an act of being, it's an act of becoming. That holiness and meaning and value is something that can be acquired only if we put in the time and are committed. That meaning and value isn't something we're one day going to arrive at or discover. Rather, it's something constantly working towards. When we reflect on the Jewish calendar, we immediately notice that all the different holidays in our tradition have their symbolism. Last week on Rosh Hashanah, we have the shofar. Next week on Sukkot, the lulav and etrog. Passover, the matzah. We can, of course, go on. It's only today, it's only Yom Kippur that comes to us symbolless. We have no specific ritualistic tools to aid us in our journey. We, of course, will have no festive foods to evoke the nostalgia of the day. We have no religious crutch with which we can lean on. No possibility of mistaking the ritual for the real work of deep personal introspection. No, on Yom Kippur, today, the only symbol of the day is ourselves. It's a screaming reminder that each of us are always standing at the precipice of this infinite landscape, with only ourselves and our internal ability to create holiness through our commitments to loved ones, our commitments to ideas, commitments to things we value, and of course, commitments to a sacred tradition passed down across oceans and throughout centuries. On Yom Kippur, on this awesome, fearful day that the Torah refers to as Shabbat Shabbaton, the ultimate time of reflection, in this wonderful, joyous moment that the Talmud refers to as the happiest day on our calendar, on this auspicious day that same Abraham Joshua Heschel deemed the great cathedral of Jewish time, we truly have the chance to reimagine our commitments, our obligations, and where and how we want to create holiness in our world. Gemar Chetima Tova.